This video is sponsored by War Thunder. Find out how to get onto the battlefield later on in the video. It has been 85 years since the Battle of Dunkirk. A battle which, had it gone another way, could have changed the course of the war. And so, why not imagine that? What we've done here is reimagine this battle in a new way. An alternate history cinematic. Really, our equivalent to the Manhattan Project, which also took a colossal amount of time and money to see through. For those of you who haven't seen parts 1, 2, and 3, this is the complete experience for you. For those who did, this isn't a rehash. We've supercharged parts 1 and 2 with 4K ships and plane models, along with revised narration, rebuilt part 3 with never-before-seen archival depth, added the explosive finale of part 4, tying the war's end into one gripping climax. The level of detail in both storytelling and visuals was only possible because of our patrons and channel members. So if you want to see more fully realized timelines with somewhat blockbuster proportions, why not consider becoming one? That said, enjoy the show. We've heard it a million times before. Germany wins the Battle of Britain, or Stalingrad, or magically gets its hands on nukes before the Allies do, winning World War II. Right. The truth is, despite being the most popular topic that most people associate alternate history with, there is hardly a single one of these scenarios which is based in reality. I'm talking about a reasonable timeline, one that doesn't massively alter major decisions or bring in the alien space bats. What if there was a scenario where the push of one small domino cascades into a German victory? Well, Jimmy, after digging through countless archives, I think I have an idea. So, a quick recap. After years of preparation and careful annexation under the Allies' policy of appeasement, Moustache Man, that's what we're calling him for this video, is ready to take things further. Germany rolls over Poland in September 1939, with the Soviets joining in for a good old partition. That November, the Soviets invaded Finland, in the winter, and the following April, Germany rolls through Denmark and Norway. But then, the unimaginable happened. Well, it's pretty imaginable now because we know what happened. On May 10th, 1940, Germany launched a blitzkrieg attacking the Netherlands, Belgium, and France with its entire might. The same day Winston Churchill took office. What took Germany years to take back in World War I was accomplished in 2 weeks. Despite fierce resistance, the Maginot Line, and the nearly 400,000-strong British Expeditionary Force, Paris fell in 35 days. This outcome was shocking, not only to the Allies, but the German High Command as well. In fact, Rommel disobeyed direct orders and used his panzers to cut off a huge portion of troops, pressing them against the English Channel. This rapid advance threatened to overextend the German line, as infantry was struggling to keep up with their tanks, many of which were starting to run out of fuel. That is when an order was given. An order to halt the advance against the port city of Dunkirk on May 24th, to the astonishment of the ground generals who wanted to press their advantage. I think you can see where I'm going with this. Nearly 500,000 Allied personnel were trapped in this tight pocket, awaiting evacuation, and Moustache Man decided to bomb them like fish in a barrel, using the Luftwaffe, which had complete air superiority, fearing an Allied counterattack. 2 days later, the decision was reversed. But this delay, plus a change of command, gave precious time for the miracle of Dunkirk to happen. The waters around Dunkirk were too shallow, so hundreds of civilian boats and a few destroyers were deployed. And in the course of 9 days, the brave last-stand resistance from the French and Belgian forces allowed for 338,000 troops to be rescued back to Britain. You've probably heard that story before, but what rarely gets mentioned here is the weather. You see, out of those 9 days, just 2 had optimal flying conditions, which resulted in staggering losses for the Allies, including the loss of 9 warships. But what do I mean by bad weather conditions? Well, Jimmy, I could tell you, or I could let you experience that for yourself thanks to the sponsor of today's video, War Thunder. Do you like jets, ships, tanks, and choppers? Well then, War Thunder is the game for you. War Thunder, the sponsor of today's video, has over 2,500 vehicles to choose from 10 different nations. So many vehicles for you to crash horrifically. Customize any vehicle you desire in a wide range of options. Fight in realistic or arcade environments. You don't even need a flight stick. All you need is your mouse, keyboard, and fingers. Fly anything from biplanes to modern battle tanks. I am informed you cannot fly the battle tank. All of these vehicles are modeled down to the smallest detail. Look how detailed that is. It truly feels like you're in control of these powerful war machines thanks to realistic sounds and/or effects. So, what are you waiting for? Join 70 million other people in this global community. Fight in epic PvP battles on PC, Xbox, or PlayStation, and now even mobile. And what's best is that it's free. If you want to sign up or want to return to the action after not playing for 6 months, then click the links in the description to get a massive bonus pack, multiple premium vehicles, and Eagle of Valor, an exclusive vehicle decorator, not to mention 100,000 silver lions and 7 days of premium account. So why not join in the battle? Play War Thunder today. Right. So, back to the beaches of Dunkirk, where hundreds of thousands of men await their fate. The thing is, the idea of holding back, preventing a counterattack, and picking out both men and precious ships from the Royal Navy isn't a bad one. So I wouldn't really change that controversial order, which was withdrawn anyway 2 days later. What I would change, however, is the weather. Britain held a lot of their fighter planes back, afraid of a direct attack from the German Air Force, meaning that all those evacuation vessels would become easy pickings for the Luftwaffe. Panic ensues, and fearing that there's no way out, a huge portion of the expeditionary force simply takes up arms, joins the French, and fights back. What we see is bogged down urban warfare, where thousands die on both sides. But ultimately, the pocket is squeezed in. As in our timeline, the Belgian King Leopold issues his unconditional surrender on May 28th. And within a week, almost everyone at Dunkirk is either dead or captured. Sure, some would be evacuated and live to fight another day, but consider this. On the first day of the evacuation, with very limited pressure from the Germans, only 7,600 soldiers were ferried across the channel. At best, I'd say no more than 40,000 are rescued. In our timeline, Britain had just over 40,000 soldiers captured in the entire Battle of France. But after this alternate Dunkirk disaster, that number skyrockets to 240,000. More than half of the troops that left the Isles. And we're not just talking about any regular troops here. These were regulars. Huge difference. Trained professionals who could have come home and drilled thousands more, which would eventually be useful to fight the Germans and Italians in Africa, Sicily, eventually Normandy. Instead, in this alternate timeline, these guys are now POWs. A massive stain on Churchill's record. Additionally, with clear skies, even more British warships would find their way to the bottom of the channel. Not enough to make Operation Sea Lion a reality or anything, but enough to add to the horror the British public was already experiencing. By the end of June, France signs its unconditional surrender. This means that the lowlands join Denmark and Norway in its occupation. France is replaced with Vichy France. Poland is partitioned. Central Europe is under Moustache Man's thumb. Spain is ruled by Franco, Italy by Mussolini, and the Swiss are just chillin'. Britain stands alone. And a furious and embarrassed Winston Churchill, who wishes he could say "I told you so," hears the deafening cries of fathers, mothers, and brothers who scream, "Bring our boys home." When we look at military conflicts, what we usually look for are the direct casualties as a result of the battle, often ignoring deaths caused by illnesses, which surpass them in every major conflict, unless it was the Russo-Japanese War. But what also gets equally neglected are the captives. The reality is that captives, especially high-ranking ones, play a huge role, including in World War II. Deaths can be martyred, but knowing a huge portion of men are still overseas, awaiting an uncertain fate, that can cause a lot of political pressure. In our timeline, an equally isolated Britain had only one reason to continue the fight: survival. But what if there was an alternative? What if peace could be made, and also allow for 250,000 Britons to come back home? The miracle of Dunkirk was a huge morale booster. But here, it breaks the slim majority in the British war cabinet. In late May, as France was going down, it spent 2 days in session, during which Lord Halifax made a proposal to, quote, explore German terms of peace. The session was made up of 5 members, 2 of which, Halifax and Chamberlain, voted for, while Churchill, Attlee, and Greenwood voted against. How hard would it be to imagine that Britain would choose to seek out peace terms? I think in these conditions, that would be very likely, either with or without Churchill. Winston would fight this eventuality with every part of his being, of course, but even he couldn't stop it here. That said, his stubbornness and will to go on would prevent him from resigning and handing over power to the appeasers. No, he would stay and carry on the fight covertly. So, in early July 1940, through an intermediate, most likely Italy, high-ranking members from both sides could meet in a conference to discuss terms. This was a real plan on the table, which Churchill even allowed Halifax to explore, something which is shown in a lot more detail in the movie Darkest Hour. Italy wasn't belligerent in the war yet, and Mussolini didn't want to be sidelined by Moustache Man on the world stage. Moustache Man's promises to the German people were kept to the letter, and he seemed unstoppable. But considering everything we know about him at this stage of his life, he would have probably given Britain soft terms of peace. Nothing like the unconditional surrenders of the lowlands in France. We would probably see war reparations being imposed. Malta and Gibraltar given to Italy and Spain respectfully. Special rights over trade could be demanded, especially concerning the Suez, as well as a formal recognition of the Reich's newly gained territories. Finally, a policy of isolationism could be forced upon the British, banning them from aiding any resistance groups or meddling in the affairs of Europe even further. Something which would have dire consequences for Greece and Yugoslavia, so sorry guys. In return, the British could gain a non-aggression treaty with Germany for say like 5 years, and have all their captured soldiers brought back unharmed. Within like 2 months, the entire Western Front is secure, and now Germany could rest easy, or at least focus its entire strength on that Russian bear. Before we turn east, it's important to look back at the exact timeline of events here. In our world, British defiance is followed up with the Battle of Britain, which more or less cripples the Luftwaffe. Between mid-July and late October of 1940, it lost 2,000 aircraft trying to soften up the ground targets and beat out the Royal Air Force. Aircraft can be replaced, but since the battle was fought over British soil, any German pilot who parachuted out of their aircraft would find themselves in hostile territory, on an island. The Allied pilots, on the other hand, could easily be given a bandage, respawn, and join a new match. Ultimately, the loss of its best pilots was deeply felt, and this was a blow from which the German Air Force never really recovered. In the meantime, Italy also wanted a piece of the action, after their failed attempt at aiding Germany against France. So they picked someone their own size, alone, to prove their military prowess. You can imagine how that went. After that disastrous campaign, the Reich stepped in and snowballed through Yugoslavia and Greece between April and June of 1941. Many argued that this side quest delayed the surprise invasion of the Soviet Union, but not really. You see, in order to conduct their operations, the Germans needed to wait for the ground to harden, so at most, they lost like a single month. That being said, the wear and tear on their vehicles and aircraft, the fatigue of their soldiers, and the expenditure of resources did take a toll on the army. Finally, when Germany did invade the Soviets in late June, not during the winter like many believe, it was a massive success. Within 1 month, Brest-Litovsk, Minsk, Riga, Lviv, and Smolensk fell. But by the time winter did come, the German advance slowed down. in large part due to the confusing decision to move armored units around, first away from Army Group Center and then later back to it. More than anything, it was the delay and wear and tear of this maneuver that cost the Germans Leningrad and other strategic targets. And then by October, good old Uncle Sam in Britain began sending numerous shipments of supplies and equipment, prolonging the fight. The rest is history. But after a disastrous Dunkirk and pieced out Britain, yeah, the timeline's history is kind of different. In the short term, the last stand at Dunkirk means that Germany sustained some extra casualties and obtained slightly less military hardware. But that also means no Battle of Britain, aka the Luftwaffe doesn't get nerfed. Additionally, with Britain pledging to not interfere in the continent, Greece and Yugoslavia don't get the valuable aid they received in our timeline. Now, does that mean that Italy would succeed? Obviously not. But it does mean that the invasion of the Balkans starts sooner and ends much quicker. Actually, it's even possible for them, especially Yugoslavia, to go the we're kinda with the Axis but not really route that Bulgaria took. Germany has only one front to worry about, and engages the Soviet Union in early June of 1941. A completely unprepared communist frontline collapses, as the Wehrmacht speedruns through the Eastern Front. For just a moment, I want to highlight what is now called the German-Soviet Air War on June 22, 1941, the largest air battle in military history. On one side, you have just over 10,000 Soviet aircraft. On the other, 3,300 German. Now, if you didn't know, Germany won. But try to guess how many aircraft were lost by the Luftwaffe. Don't worry, I'll wait. Whatever you guessed, you're probably wrong, because the real answer is 55. 55 aircraft to the Soviets' 4,000. The preemptive strikes on Soviet airfields, more effective radio systems, superior aircraft, and pilot experience all led to one outcome: total German dominance. Messerschmitts and Junkers patrolled the air and rained fire from above. The Wehrmacht knew exactly where the enemy was, while the Soviets scrambled from one defense line to the next. All of this happened in our timeline, even with the heavy losses at the Battle of Britain. Now imagine what an even stronger Air Force could do. To state the obvious right away, do you really think the siege of Leningrad would have lasted over 2 years under these conditions? The mobility of both ground and air forces allows for an even more deadly blitzkrieg. Before the well-known failure at Stalingrad, many couch tacticians are quick to point out the missed opportunities at Leningrad and Moscow, both of which were within Moustache Man's grasp. The extra month, extra munitions, extra aircraft and pilots, and improved organization might not be enough to take out both by the end of 41, but at least one of them is surely going down. The next big thing on the agenda is Lend-Lease. Does Roosevelt really just sit back and observe as Germany takes over continental Europe? Well, yeah. No, seriously. What could America really do? Britain was the crucial connection to the continent, and even if they did choose to break the treaty with Germany, the aid sent through the Persian Gulf, Arctic, and Pacific would be little too late. History is all about timing, and if one of the three army groups achieved its main goal, that being Leningrad, Moscow, or Stalingrad, the fall of the other two would become a lot easier. Hypothetically, let's say Leningrad falls first. That's almost an extra 1,000,000 troops, and a ton of hardware now making its way for Moscow. Once Moscow falls, it's off to Stalingrad, and the oil fields of the Caucasus. Oh, don't worry, I didn't forget about those oil fields. There is no timeline in which Germany could sustain a prolonged war on multiple fronts, with dangers looming from Britain, Africa, and the East. But in this one hypothetical, the full might of the Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe simply breaks down Stalin within 18 months. As crazy as that sounds, America can supply rebel groups year-round, and it won't make much of a difference, even with the broken Enigma code at the end of 42. I know it sounds crazy. Not to mention that Japan still hits Pearl Harbor, leading to a very bleak reality. By mid-1943, the Axis powers dominate the Old World, and in their triumph, take a year of respite to lick their wounds, which, despite these successes, are going to be severe. Puppet states need to be propped up, resources are exploited, manpower forcefully conscripted, and Germany takes on a new super project. one not simply aimed at restoring its manpower, tanks, and aircraft to full capacity. Oh no, we're talking about building a Kriegsmarine worthy of taking on the Royal Navy. Goliath battleships that would make the Bismarck seem like a ferry boat, and an armada of U-boats. This would be a Germany that's in at least a better position. Not the perfect position, but a better one. So the Bismarck took about 27 months to build, a feasible timeline, in which the entire might of the Reich is focused on toppling the final thorn in its side. Non-aggression treaties be damned. Let's say in May 1945, the air raid sirens blare from Plymouth to Norwich, and the Spitfires take to the skies. Intercepted Enigma codes allow the Brits to hold off most of the bombing raids at a great cost. But then comes the battle at sea. HMS Vanguard, King George, and the Prince of Wales face off against the newest class of super ships in an epic standoff. Germany gives itself a few months to break down as much of the enemy morale, ships, and aircraft as possible, while amassing a million force, mostly made up of Eastern Front veterans. The best of the best, ready to launch a reverse Normandy, which would, 6th August 1945. An unsuspecting Cologne is obliterated by Little Boy. Few days later, Hamburg, the most important coastal city and major shipyard for the Kriegsmarine, follows suit. The American giant is awake, and while Turing was decrypting Enigma codes in Bletchley Park, Oppenheimer was ushering in the atomic age in Los Alamos. The nuking of Germany was the original goal of the Manhattan Project. It was only sidelined after the rapid success of Stalingrad and Normandy. In our timeline, the atomic bombings were little more than a cherry on top. However, here, in a timeline where Germany actually succeeds, the nukes are a game changer. An Allied D-Day type campaign would be impossible with a pacified Russia. The atomic bombs would basically be an ace in the hole designed to solve a problem exactly such as this. And that's a hand that could only be played twice, at least in the short term. Germany was always the main target here. What happens next? How does Germany react? Does the bombing take out Moustache Man? Do the bombings prompt large-scale rebellions in Europe? What often happens in alternate history scenarios is there's a single idea, or point of divergence, that's investigated as a thought experiment. But due to popular demand, this will now become an entire timeline. The thing is now, with each step we take beyond the POD, things become more complicated, but much more interesting. For example, there are many theories out there about what would have happened if Spain joined the Axis in World War II. Taken at face value, this is an interesting scenario that ultimately leads to an even quicker Axis defeat. But in this Dunkirk disaster timeline, Franco joining comes along with a lot of other changes. Notably, that change happened off-screen. So before we return to the altered Cologne nuked 1945, let's catch up on the rest of the globe. How did Britain's exit from the war and fall of the Soviets in '43 affect the world? Ever since the 1848 revolutions, large waves of German immigrants constantly made their way to South America, a land which resembled their homeland, where they could raise cattle, climb mountains, and drink beer under the warm sun. By the time World War II came around, those communities had deep roots in countries like Brazil, Argentina, and Chile, affecting the decision-making of the states themselves. That being said, while even in our timeline a few hundred of them flirted with the idea of Axis alignment, the Atlantic, and more importantly, the metaphorical American gun to their heads, would easily dissuade them of such notions, leaving things, as for now, relatively the same in our timeline. Then there's Africa. With Britain out of the war, the North and East African campaigns just don't happen. In fact, with nobody to support them, Free France never gets established. A quick, but very important aside. In the previous video, I said that peace would be obtained with or without Churchill. That goes without question. But Churchill's stubbornness does force him to accept the terms, with the glimmer of hope that he could one day reverse the fate of Europe. This means that Charles de Gaulle and other resistance fighters are given refuge and sent over to America. But as a whole, Vichy France retains all African colonies, as Africa awaits for Germany to light the candle in 45. Unlike the Great War, the Second World War really lived up to its name. This conflict encompassed the entire planet. Hell, there was even fighting over Antarctica. This was a time when everyone had to pick a side, especially in Europe. And sure, you look at a map and see there were several neutral states, but in reality, each of them was leaning one side or another. On the pro-Allies camp, we had Turkey, Portugal, and Ireland. Over on the pro-Axis camp, you got the SSS of Sweden, Switzerland, and Spain. The only country that does not change its stance on this timeline is Ireland. Everyone else hops on the Reich bandwagon. Sweden was already surrounded by Axis members, supplied Germany with over half of their iron, and allowed its troops to move through its territory on their way to Russia. Moustache Man really didn't bother integrating the Swedes into his coalition, since they were already giving him everything he wanted. Plus, he feared that their direct involvement would make them an easy target for British bombing. But in a timeline where they witness an expanded Finland, triumphant Germany, and pacified Britain, Sweden would be very easy to persuade. These same arguments would be very persuasive for the Swiss, but even more so than Sweden, they served Germany's interests far better as a neutral country, which was already towing the line. From the European perspective, after the fall of Moscow, the war was already over. In our timeline, many countries rushed to change their stance in 1944, when the writing was on the wall. Same goes here. For example, just look at how Franco changed his tune, and then how the West treated Franco in the name of combating communism. Speaking of the Spanish dictator, him joining the Axis would fundamentally alter the timeline. It's weird to think that Sweden was more helpful and cooperative to the Axis than Spain ever was in our timeline, but it turns out despite being bailed out during the Civil War, Franco was incredibly reluctant to return the favor. After the fall of France, he met with Moustache Man and started to haggle. His demands included vast amounts of food and fuel, which would restore the Spanish economy, French Morocco, Cameroon, and parts of Algiers. He even asked for mainland French territories, more specifically its Basque and Catalan lands. Finally, he declared that he would officially join the Axis only after those demands were met. A few years later, Germany once again tried to persuade him via threats and promises, just so they could move troops across Spain in order to attack Gibraltar. But he refused. Yeah, you would need a serious POD that changes Franco's mind. But luckily, that's exactly what we have here. In this alternate timeline, in order to get his captured soldiers back, Churchill is forced to cede Gibraltar to Spain, and Malta to Italy, as outlined in the last video, effectively losing British power projection in the Western Mediterranean. This on Germany's part would be a very generous gift, buying the allegiance of both dictators. Furthermore, Franco was terrified of the British, but with them being pacified, they become a non-issue. Perhaps there's the sweetener of French Morocco to seal the deal, as well as substantial economic aid, which would only increase in the years after the fall of the Soviet Union. An Axis Spain, and ever-growing German success, would send direct messages to Portugal's own dictator, Antonio Salazar. Like Franco, he was a shrewd man, who did everything in his power to stay neutral, reaping the profit from both sides. In this alternate world, Portugal would probably be forced to break its treaty with Britain and join the Axis in order to prevent a violent takeover, around the time Greece or Leningrad fell. In our world, Portugal allowed the Allies to use the Azores in 1943 for crucial bases. Here, that allowance is mirrored, granting the U-boats a base of operations deep into the Atlantic, long before the big fight in 1945 begins. So, in summary, the Axis is joined by Spain in 1940, Sweden in 1942, and Portugal in 1943, with a combined population of 41.6 million people, and the GDP equivalent of Australia or Argentina at the time. None of them had a particularly powerful military, but their manpower, projection, and most of all navy would certainly come in handy for the war to come. Oh yeah, there's also one other neutral country I haven't mentioned yet. The Republic of Turkey. The old man of Europe was revolutionized by the Young Turks. And now, a few years after the death of Kemal Ataturk, Turkey made the decision to remain neutral, as his right-hand man and successor continued with the reforms. Due to its strategic position, both sides made many offers, but the Turkish government was concerned by both the Soviet aggression and Italian dreams of a new Rome. That being said, the country had a zealous movement, believing in pan-Turkism, hoping to unite with other Turkish-speaking people, particularly those in the Caucasus. In this alternate timeline, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, Germany is now able to project power and offer a unique win-win solution. You see, the Soviet Republic of Azerbaijan worked around the clock to provide the Union with 70% of its oil, and it was staunchly against the German invaders. They even mobilized 700,000 soldiers to the war effort, or a fifth of its population. German occupational forces were already stretched thin. So, in return for ceding the territory to Turkey, they might not only join the Axis, but ensure the oil shipments never stop. Insert blatantly obvious reference to Dune here. Speaking of oil, the more I research this topic, the more I'm stunned by how important this resource really was. Which, like, no duh, but still. For his birthday in 1942, Moustache Man even got a cake shaped like Baku. Ideology aside, so many wars are mainly driven to get key resources, and there is rarely a point in time when such a valuable resource is spread in such a uneven way. The closest second I can even come up with is how unfairly coal was distributed during the Industrial Revolution. Today, oil is produced all over the place. But in 1940, when the technology was still developing, you only had a few key sites. Iran, Iraq, Azerbaijan, Venezuela, Mexico, Indonesia, and East Texas. Of the 4 locations in the Eastern Hemisphere, 3 were right next to each other, and Germany was planning to push forward from the Caucasus all the way into Iran and Iraq. Between 1948 and 1958, major oil fields would be discovered in Canada, Libya, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Kazakhstan, China, and the North Sea. That is partially why the UK and Soviets went crazy in our timeline, when they discovered that Iran had Axis sympathies, and they held anti-British protests. BP was drilling the hell out of Persia, giving Iran only 16% of the profits, and the mere threat of that going away was enough for them to launch an invasion alongside the Soviet Union. Just 2 months after Barbarossa, Iran fell within 6 days, and became the first nation to be split in 2 by the Allies, with North Iran going to the Soviets, and the South going to Britain. Yes, this actually happened. A few months earlier in 1941, the exact same thing played out in Iraq, which supplied Britain with 40% of its oil. Just 2 years after obtaining limited independence, the young nation suffered a coup by a nationalist group which overthrew the pro-British government in the hope of attaining full freedom. The British response was swift, and the rebels were put down within a month. Now, in this alternate timeline, both of these events still occur, even with the German demand that the empire become more isolationist. Churchill could not afford to lose the Persian corridor, but at the same time, Moustache Man was too busy with Operation Barbarossa to do anything about it. After the fall of the Soviets, Iran's northern half would be overrun by the British, setting up the groundwork for a massive theater of the war, which the Germans would open up in '45. Right, so apart from some crucial allegiances being changed, the regions not mentioned in the previous video pretty much remain the same, but the Pacific Theater is the one that changes the most. At least until it all pops off with Operation Sea Lion and the nukes. Remember all those oil fields? Notice how only one of them was east of Iran. Not to mention, the Dutch East Indies produced 1/15 of the amount of barrels East Texas did. That strategic situation meant that after the 1941 oil embargo, if Japan wanted to keep their empire, they had no other choice but to attack it, and everything else that stood in its path. Looking back, it really is insane at how much the West underestimated Japan. Japan still attacks Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, Guam, Wake Island, British Malay, Hong Kong, and the Dutch Indies. Now, you would think that a pieced out Britain would put up a better fight against the Japanese, but the truth is, they underestimated them just as much as America did. Moreover, non-aggression treaty or not, Britain would still fear German aggression, and was busy operating in the Middle East. The first wave would proceed the same way as it did in our timeline, but starting in 42, Lord Mountbatten would receive a lot more support in his operations in British Burma. It's an easy bar to beat, considering the British barely sent 2 infantry divisions in our timeline. In our world, the Casablanca Conference outlined several key issues for the Allies. Roosevelt wanted to build up China and aid it as much as possible, but Churchill put those plans on hold, prioritizing action in Europe. Since in this alternate timeline those actions were a far-fetched dream, Chinese assistance would be much more amplified, slowing down Japanese progress on every frontier. On the other hand, the looming German threat also means that Japan is treated more as a side quest if anything, not worth wasting precious nukes on. Since the Soviet Union falls apart, those nearly worthless provinces in the Far East might be taken over by the Japanese, while the Allies commit their entire strength in defending off Germany. No Soviets and no concluded operations in Europe means no Operation Downfall, and no end in sight for the conflict in China. The Japanese have a much harder time in China and Burma, but America and the Commonwealth are just too busy to land a kill shot, buying the Japanese more precious time. Now let's circle back and examine the buffed up Reich and its opening moves. In our timeline, the Axis never had a shot, but given a few extra years of preparation and experience, on top of a defeated Soviet Union, plus a few more extra Axis members, and what you end up with is a very even fight. The Allies have spent the last few years preparing for the inevitable attack. But like the Japanese in our timeline, they didn't anticipate Moustache Man breaking the 5-year treaty 3 months before it expired, and attacking in May 1945. Crucially, the attack comes in just a month after the passing of FDR, giving Truman a similar test that Churchill faced in 1940. Provided with Swedish iron, Spanish tungsten, oil from Baku, and grain from Ukraine, Albert Speer is able to fulfill many of the ambitious promises to the Reich. One of those was the 20,000 aircraft, including many new models like the jet-propelled Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulf-Ta 152, who now made bombing runs over the English Channel. U-boats suddenly descend upon transatlantic shipping from the Azores, while the upgraded Kriegsmarine drill in preparation for Operation Sea Lion. Instead of being shipped away on Operation Paperclip, Wernher von Braun's V-2 rockets are launched from occupied Holland in the hundreds. While London was getting battered, the Empire would be struck on 3 other crucial fronts. It's too early for the millions of Wehrmacht soldiers to board the ships, which is why 200,000 men with an ample supply and armada of tanks strike British Egypt alongside Italians and Spaniards. Lifting off from Crete and Anatolia, the Luftwaffe descend upon Cairo and Cyprus, smashing every port and airbase they could find. Malta is stripped away from the British, and within a month, the entire Mediterranean is dominated by the Italian Regia Marina. A month or 2 later, coastal Egypt is in Axis hands, which now prepare to rendezvous with the Second African Theater. So, stepping back, a lot of people like to trash talk Italy's military performance, but they might not have heard their actions or luck in the often forgotten East African campaign. Unless you play Hearts of Iron 4, then you've probably heard of it. Mussolini envisioned the capture of Egypt and Sudan, connecting his colonial empire. At first, they reaped some success in Somaliland, despite heavy casualties. In January 1941, the British initiated Operation Camilla, broadcasting false information, tipping the Italians off that they were moving troops and preparing to attack Somaliland. Instead, they were preparing to attack Eritrea by land. But in a stroke of accidental brilliance or luck, the Italians decided to let the presumed British land first, redeploying coincidentally to where the British were actually coming from. This resulted in the stunning and decisive success of the Italian army, which pushed the Commonwealth all the way back to Cairo. Yeah, that was a joke. Italy was crushed. Ethiopia was liberated, resulting in the first real victory for the Allies and the destruction of Mussolini's colonial dreams. And while we're at it, the Portuguese colonial empire too. So here's the thing, even in a timeline where the Axis powers were buffed up, against a more prepared Allied force, backed up by American troops, Italy still crumbles, losing their holdings in East Africa. More importantly, this is the first taste of combat in 5 years for the Commonwealth soldiers, and a good opportunity to practice their combined operations with the Yankees, something which will be very important in the theater that everyone had their eyes on. So far, we have one swift victory for the Axis in Egypt, and another swift defeat in Ethiopia. But that draw would be broken in the Middle East, where both sides could pour tanks, airplanes, and troops in order to contest for the abundant oil resources there. The Axis held Syria, Turkey, and the Caucasus, while the Allies could rely on the safe Indian Ocean to deliver their troops via the Persian Gulf. The wide-open floodplains, jagged mountains, and deserts of the region would become the key battleground and the true trial by fire for the Allies, who would be met by none other than the Desert Fox himself. Only this time, he would enjoy copious amounts of fuel, allowing him to outmaneuver his enemies with ease. The other key advantage for the Axis here is the fact that for once, they were actually liberating occupied people who despised British rule. On the eve of World War II, America had only 439 tanks, and despite a ramped up industry, island hopping and naval battles with the Japanese would do little to prepare the ground force for this campaign. That being said, the Allies had powerful tools in their kits as well. Logistics were easier, technology, especially in the air, was superior, and while the Germans had better officers, the Allies cracked the Enigma code. But it would take a lot of time for experience to be obtained. Time and a lot of dead bodies. As the German war machine plowed through the desert sands, western Iraq and all of Palestine would fall to the Blitzkrieg, while advances in Iran would be more difficult. The battles in Africa, the Middle East, and all over the English Channel would be intense, and on each front, the Axis would have the upper hand. But then, in August 1945, Truman drops the nukes over Cologne and Hamburg, killing over 1 million people in an instant. After years of stockpiling aircraft and bombs, both sides unleash all their fury across the English Channel. Spitfires and Mustangs versus Messerschmitts in aerial combat, which would pave the way for a naval invasion from one side or the other. Considering this is an overconfident mustache man we're talking about, the Germans would likely throw everything and the kitchen sink at the Allies, but for every plane the Luftwaffe takes down, America ships in 2 more. But Uncle Sam wasn't all muscle, he had brains, and they achieved their task at Los Alamos. Amidst the maelstrom, the B-29 Superfortress was able to nuke both Cologne and Hamburg, inflicting a major wound on Germany, while simultaneously turning it even more fanatical. Over 500,000 people are vaporized, raising the stakes. In the midst of the confusion, a major operation is conducted by the Allies, who seize all Portuguese territory in Africa. More importantly, a Pearl Harbor-level attack is initiated against the Azores, risking American aircraft carriers in return for eliminating the valuable submarine base. Action in Africa and Iraq convinces Truman and Churchill that the key to the war is hitting Germany's underbelly, namely its Italian and Spanish allies. If they could pull off a D-Day operation in Spanish Morocco, then maybe, just maybe, they could win the war. August 1945. The Soviet Union is occupied up to the AA line. Spain, Portugal, and Turkey have joined the Axis. 2 German cities have been nuked, and an intense war is waged over the English Channel and Middle East. With no peace treaty or neutrality acts holding them down, the Americans and British prepare to unleash all their meticulously crafted toys. Just 4 months after the death of Roosevelt, Truman kicked off his presidency by pressing the big red button. But the follow-up had been planned since 1941. The war industry had kicked off after Pearl Harbor, but apart from covert operations, the Allies could do little more but stand by as Germany engulfed the Soviet Union. This came at a great cost, but it also created a vast disparity in experience. Moustache Man, what's the point of this, YouTube? Why do you keep demonetizing these videos despite me avoiding saying his name? I even made sure to have that particular Hindu symbol covered up, and it didn't matter. Nukes in Korea? Fine. Calling out Stalin and blowing up Chernobyl? A-okay. But talking about the most famous war in history? Now that's too far. Rant aside, I'm gonna make bonus content exclusively for my Patreon and YouTube members. So hey, check that out. Anyway, Moustache Man, God I hate saying that, had been in power since 1933. And with the win over the Soviets in 1944, he spent a year prepping for this encounter. In our timeline, World War II can be seen as one big conflict, with a prologue in Ethiopia, China, and Spain. But in this alternate timeline, the big war is split into 3 distinct phases. Germany taking over Poland, Denmark, Norway, and France, ending with the peace treaty with Britain in 1940, Germany attacking the Soviets while Japan bombs Pearl Harbor a year later, and lastly, May 1945. A well-organized German Wehrmacht, Luftwaffe, and Kriegsmarine attempt to crush the British Empire. With Britain phased out of the war until that point, it makes no sense to declare war on America until 1945, and when Moustache Man does, it blows up in his face. Or should I say, it blows up in Cologne and Hamburg. Ouch. In our world, Goebbels used the bombing of Dresden to launch a propaganda campaign aimed at revoking the Geneva Conventions and spurring on new recruits. Rather than seeing that happen in the closing chapters of the war, here we see that at its very onset. Germany's own Pearl Harbor. Something so horrific, it's seared into the public consciousness. And now, it was time for Germany to unveil its own super weapon. Until this point, I intentionally left out Iceland from the picture for the sake of pacing, but if you're one of my 21,000 viewers from Iceland, first off, hi. Second, strap in, because this is your first and only mention. Just like the dual invasion of Iran by the British and the Soviets in 1941, the Russian invasion of Iceland in 1940 tends to be swept under the rug. Essentially, in order to prevent it from falling into German hands, the British sent in some Marines and occupied Iceland for the duration of the war. Germany considered going there themselves, but calculated that the cost of maintaining the island would outweigh the benefits. In this alternate timeline, this would unfold the exact same way, only 5 years later. So far so good. Iceland is denied. Now for the other big base of operations, one that could cut Britain out of its empire. A small chain of Portuguese islands, strategically located just 1,500 miles away from Boston, beating out how close Hawaii was to California by 900 miles. A fun fact which both Roosevelt and Dan B067 were both well aware of. The famous War Plan Grey from our timeline never had to be put into place, since Portugal never ended up leasing its bases to the Germans. But having joined the Axis in 1943, this scenario gives the Germans 2 full years to pack these islands full of U-boat wolf packs and heavy fortifications. July 1945, days before the Trinity test, and 2 months since the Azores were used to sink countless convoys full of men and equipment coming in from the Commonwealth. Truman and Churchill prepare an armada to take out the Wolf Den. The cracked Enigma codes outlined the numbers and positions of the enemy vessels, but nothing could prepare the Allies for what came next. HMS Hood, HMS Queen Elizabeth, HMS Warspite, HMS Indomitable, all escorted by cruisers and destroyers, sailed side by side with the American Navy. Truman sent in the battleships USS Texas and her sister USS New York, as well as USS Arkansas, Colorado, and the new USS Iowa. Alongside them were the aircraft carriers USS Ranger and USS Yorktown, a formidable armada. After all, with the Mediterranean in Axis hands, this was the only corridor from which Anzac forces could arrive. But this Germany, 1945 Germany, with all of the oil and metal it could wish for, without a disrupted economy and a vast amount of naval ports, manages to produce cutting-edge equipment and vehicles. Enter the Type 21 Electro U-boat, the first true modern submarine. The template used by the Americans, British, and Soviets for all future subs. Germany had many of these crazy projects, which either failed to materialize due to, lack of materials, or managed to produce only a handful of them. The Electro boat was in the latter category since it came to life in 1944, but here, in this alternate timeline, the Azores have dozens of them. Its design minimized the acoustic signature, making it harder for sonar to pick up on its location when submerged. The Allied Armada would succeed in bombing the hell out of the many island bases, but at the cost of losing nearly every ship, as well as thousands of sailors. Fighter pilots would see their aircraft carriers sink to the bottom of the Atlantic with nowhere to land. This painful crash course is one the Allies would never forget. From that point on, naval traffic is rerouted to go from the Indian Ocean to the Caribbean, before eventually hoping to make it past the wolf packs and into Britain. This scenario isn't just speculation for the sake of speculation. It's really just expanding on plans that were in place from both sides. Things like Operation Barbarossa, the Middle Eastern Campaign, the Manhattan Project, experimental designs, and War Plan Grey. This next chapter isn't any different. On January 27th, 1939, Moustache Man orders Plan Z into action. The rearmament and expansion of the Kriegsmarine by 1948. This project is given the highest industrial priority. Interestingly enough, we know what would have been ordered: 4 aircraft carriers, 68 destroyers, and 10 battleships. In our timeline, this was scrapped in less than a year due to oil, but thanks to Romania and the Caucasus in this scenario, that's no longer an issue. With the help of Baltic bases, an infinite Swedish metal cheat, and German engineering, the Royal Navy now has a run for its money. A few of you pointed out that 5 more years was just not enough time for Germany to build a legit navy, and I get that. But consider this. In 1933, post-Versailles Germany had an army of 100,000 troops, and no air force to speak of. Then look what happened. An alternate buildup of its navy wouldn't be impossible. It just wasn't the main priority in our timeline. With the first conflict settled, Germany now has time to fully focus on countering the British. So in 1945, the two meet in the North Sea. Rather than having one side rush things while the other just plays a strategic long game, there's now a state of panic and urgency all around. Truman and Churchill have a lot to prove, and Moustache Man kinda waits too long to play with his new toy. Speaking of which, it should be mentioned that by 1945, the Führer's health was not the best. He did have mood swings that were amplified by his prescribed use of certain drugs, but that doesn't mean he would have driven the nation off a cliff with reckless decisions. This idea that Moustache Man was the one who made all the bad tactical calls really just came from him overruling decisions in the later stage of the Eastern Front, and also the Desert Fox having really good PR. A naval conflict against the British in the North Sea isn't a bad idea. It's a necessity for Germany's war effort. Now, whether they would win is another question. This alternate North Sea clash is the largest naval battle in history. By the end, the Atlantic is littered with a lot of scrap. To soften Britain up, the Kriegsmarine launches armadas from its Norwegian bases, attempting to fish out the Allies. Even with its alternate massive buff and fulfilling its naval buildup, the Kriegsmarine is still outnumbered 5-1. Additionally, unlike the Allied intelligence systems where different agencies fed their data to a centralized one, the German intelligence apparatus was divided into 3 parts: Army, Navy, and Air Force. In our timeline, all received hints that the Enigma was broken, but apart from knowing that it would cost their heads, they were never able to share notes, as the intel was segregated. Karl Donitz in our timeline pretty much knew that the code was broken, but he had no way to prove his suspicions. On top of that, the American aircraft technology was just out of this world. We're talking P-51 Mustangs, Lockheed P-80s, prototype F-86 Sabres, Bearcats, and Corsairs, all produced in massive quantities. This isn't just a one-sided battle, however. What they lacked in technology, the Luftwaffe made up for in experience. By this time in this alternate war, they had flown over Poland, France, Greece, and the Soviet Union. Hundreds of operations, creating thousands of experienced fighters. Despite their tech advantage, for those first crucial months, the Allies would be playing catch-up. Now, it's not like the Axis had no advantage. There was one revolutionary weapon that barely got any playtime in our World War II. I'm talking about the Fritz X, also known as the world's first guided bomb. This was specifically designed to deal with ships. In our timeline, a 3,000-pounder was first used in 1943, and it nearly derailed the Allied invasion of Italy. Both the British and Americans had radio-guided bombs and missiles in 1944, but the Fritz was on a whole other level. What this means is that the Brits not only had to defend against a storm of aircraft coming from France, but Spitfires and Mustangs also have to patrol the North Sea too. Now, the Allies were more than capable of sustaining the inevitable losses thanks to the American industry, but due to the Azores and Canary Islands, Truman has to take bold risks. In our timeline, the peak of U-boat activity caused a 6% interception of all convoys. Here, perhaps we see that rate go up to 10 or even 15%, just due to increased quantity and quality of submarines. So many ships and supplies, not to mention countless lives, are lost in a desperate Hail Mary to save the last resistance in Europe. Germany might even have the advantage, but then comes August 1945, when the sun rose over Germany, signifying the dawn of the atomic age. It's morning in Hamburg and Cologne, the second and fourth largest German cities. The war is all the talk on radio and newspapers, but on the ground, it's all just that, news. This is all about to change. In a sudden flash, the city center ignites. Thousands look away from the blinding light. Most are engulfed in fire. In a matter of seconds, buildings are blasted from their foundation. A fireball soars into the air before morphing into a distinct mushroom. It's a scene that's repeated twice in Germany. Now, this is something to certainly speculate. Two cities being wiped off the map in the middle of a war, and not at the end. Now, the actual consequences of Hiroshima and Nagasaki are still being debated to this day, but one major reason for that is because the bombings were at the end of the war. Was it the Soviets invading Manchuria, or was it the nukes? Doesn't matter. War's over anyway. Yet in this alternate timeline, these important German cities are nuked while Germany is still at full strength. Honestly, even stronger than in our timeline. And yet, that strength could do nothing against an actual nuclear attack. That has to be impactful. More impactful than it was with Japan. For one, by the time Hiroshima and Nagasaki were bombed, Japan had already been subjected to fire bombings. The nukes were sudden and horrific in other ways, but the Japanese populace had faced months of bombings by that point. In this alternate timeline, these bombings would be truly out of the blue. It'd be something that would shock the German populace, which in this scenario had not seen any repercussions of the war abroad. And then, without warning, that happens. Frankly, while this does destroy two enemy cities, this would be a propaganda goldmine for Germany. Even in our timeline, the bombings of Dresden were decried by the Nazi government as a crime, going too far. Avenging Dresden was pushed by Goebbels for the last few months of the war, and that was by 1945, so it didn't matter that much. In this alternate scenario, we're talking about two cities getting wiped off the map as the war's just getting started, with a death toll that would be in the hundreds of thousands, undisputed, and all for what was essentially going to be seen by the Germans as a sneak attack. A cowardly move by an inferior enemy who resorted to science instead of strength. Like, I can already imagine how this would play. If nukes had been dropped on any country that wasn't already bombed back to the Stone Age, or trapped on an island, or already lost, there would be an immense outrage by the people. Something that might have real ramifications. Despite causing some disruption to the Reich's industry for a bit, this bombing is really the German Pearl Harbor, despite them being the ones who technically started the war. But that was the past war. That doesn't really count. This is a new one. And the Americans went too far. What I'm getting at here is that things get really ugly. Like, more ugly than they did in our timeline. I could very easily imagine reprisals against many assorted groups throughout Europe. If I say anything else, this video is going to get demonetized. For many people in occupied territories and prisoners of war captured in the Middle East, the nuke is essentially spraying a wolf with pepper spray while you're still in the cage with the wolf. Sure, it can't get out of the cage, but it can vent its frustration on you. Also, the wolf now wants to obliterate London. The Allies have, or should I say had, 2 nukes, but the Germans have the V3 supergun, also known as the weapon you'd see in Red Alert. In our time, it nearly became operational. I say nearly because the Allies bombed the living hell out of the facility while it was being built. 17 times in less than a year, usually with over 100 bombers at a time. They really wanted this thing dead. So what was this superweapon? A huge underground system was built, where several of these long-range artillery guns were permanently fixed on London. Near Calais, this gun could fire 5,000-pound explosive shells traveling at around 5,000 feet per second, and capable of hitting London with deadly accuracy. It used a method called supercharging, where multiple chambers fed into the massive barrel. As for the V, similarly to the rockets, it stood for vengeance, with its sole purpose being to terrorize the British population. Speaking of rockets, Wernher von Braun wasn't idle. Oh no, he was experimenting and perfecting his rockets against the Soviets. Thanks to this alternate increased resource pool, his ballistic missiles now can be bigger, faster, pointier, and above all else, more accurate. These weapons were gonna be used anyway, but after the nukes, all bets are off. London had incredible air defenses, as well as the RAF, but it would be powerless against the V3 supergun. Even if most of its rounds missed, this weapon was far cheaper to use compared to a bombing run against a city, or the resources needed for V2 rockets. We're talking day in and day out, shells coming at Mach 4 speeds. Without question, this leads to mass evacuations of the civilian population, as well as the political heads of state. This means that Churchill and Parliament might need to head out towards Cornwall, or even Yorkshire, to prevent the potential political crises that would come if a random shell would hit. The only way to prevent all of that is to ensure that the third nuke in production was meant for the fortress of Mimoyek, where the guns were stored. A hit delivered by a B-29 could end the threat, might destroy the guns, and prevent a mass panic which the fleeing of the Prime Minister would surely cause. When this happens, radiation levels spike close to Paris, and Uncle Sam is officially out of nukes for the entire year. 32 years after Einstein's theory of relativity, and just 7 years after Chadwick discovered the neutron, it was German scientists who discovered nuclear fission. Many already speculated uranium ore to be a highly valuable resource, with Belgium even storing 1,250 tons of it on Staten Island. The mine from which the ore came from was deep within the Belgian Congo, where another 3,000 tons of it, then worthless ore, sat in storage facilities. In our timeline, after Belgium was occupied, its colonies continued to aid the Allies, selling uranium at a ludicrously high cost. But in this alternate scenario, Germany gets a free hand in taking over the colony, following a peace deal with Britain in 1940. No doubt most of those 3,000 tons still make their way to New York, as it would have taken a couple of years for Germany to actually establish control. But considering they purchased 60 tons of the ore in 1940, it's safe to assume they would stockpile it. That means that from 1941 onwards, the Manhattan Project could not rely on the Congo for its uranium enrichment program. The first 4 nukes, including the one used in Trinity, still get made thanks to the Belgian stockpiles, and the Congo mine would be acquired within a month after the war began. But it took months, several months, for the enrichment process. Canada, Colorado, and Utah did possess minor uranium deposits, but nothing in the world came close to that Congo quality. Even with an infinite amount of financing from the US government, America would be able to arm no more than 1 nuke every 2 months, starting in 1946. But until then, a lot happens in another crucial theater. Okay, so once again, on paper, what should be a relatively easy front for the Allies turns ugly in a hurry. Sure, the British have the Universal Centurion tanks alongside the A-34 Comet, both developed in late 1944, while Uncle Sam boasted upgraded EZ-8 versions of the M4 Sherman, as well as the M26 Pershing. Thanks to that earlier Iran-Iraq proxy war, the Allies loaded Iraq with a ton of hardware. Then there's Saudi Arabia, which just stumbled upon its first oil well in 1938. By 1944, regardless of the timeline, America builds a formidable airbase at Dhahran, a base close to said oil well. This gives rise to the Arabian American Oil Company, Aramco. Today, it controls 259 billion barrels worth of oil and gas reserves, unmatched by any other company globally. So, with no U-boats in proximity, tons of air bases, high-tech tanks, fighters, and bombers, as well as a British-controlled India right next door, what could possibly go wrong? Everything. Everything goes wrong. The equipment and organization of the Roman legion wasn't the reason the Empire conquered most of Europe. As Caesar proved against other Roman legions, experience was a crucial component. The only theater where the Wehrmacht could flex its muscle was its campaign against Syria, Egypt, Iraq, and Iran. Led by the Desert Fox himself, Rommel had a higher quality and quantity of troops and tanks, hardened by General Winter and fueled by the Caucasus, allowing him to rampage through the Fertile Crescent. In our timeline, the US suffered multiple failures as it tried to get its inexperienced soldiers and officer corps to adapt from its outdated strategies in North Africa. Early commanders like General Lloyd Fredendall were criticized for being indecisive and disconnected from frontline realities. This led to their replacement by more capable leaders like General George S. Patton. But all that took time which they had due to facing off against Italians and the Germans being distracted by the Soviets. Here, not only are those issues compounded, but you've got a President Truman eager for results. Additionally, you have a Winston Churchill who, well, I'll just let Teddy say it.
And let's face it, you're not all that great! You tossed away lives in Gallipoli like they were scraps off your plate!
Especially if those were Indian lives. Iraq would turn into a bloodbath. Despite the locals initially assisting the Axis against British rule, they would probably soon learn what the Ukrainians did earlier and regret their choice. By the end of 1946, Allied control might be limited to the Gulf area, with Mosul, Baghdad, Tabriz, and Tehran liberated by the Axis, where they acquire even more oil wells. Keep in mind that while the Axis suffered huge casualties, the German, Spanish, Italian, Romanian, and Turkish forces don't fare much better. Lines are drawn around Isfahan and Basra as both sides prepare for a grueling war of attrition. Over the Mediterranean, things are just as bleak. The Axis blitzkrieg rolls through Syria, Jordan, and Palestine, despite fierce resistance from the Allies. Bombers flatten Cairo, with a very high chance that a random bomb hits the pyramids, while Jerusalem is turned to dust. By the end of 1946, the nuclear arsenal is dry. A battered Britain barely stands. The Atlantic is crawling with U-boats, and all seems lost. But this is where we kiss the dreams of a decisive Axis win goodbye. This was Ali versus Foreman, Rocky versus Drago, Axis versus Allies. Hey, wait a second. The Allies needed a few rounds to get their feet wet, absorbing those big German punches at the start. There was a lot of ring rust which accumulated in the American high command since the Great War. I'm talking outdated trench warfare tactics, using tanks as infantry support vehicles rather than armored divisions. A strategic bombing theory advanced by Billy Mitchell, no not that one, but without an air force with combat experience. In 1939, America had a smaller standing army than Portugal, equipped with World War I leftovers like the M1917 helmets. Even the Navy had its weaknesses, particularly when it came to anti-air defenses. In these alternate 4.5 years between Pearl Harbor and the nuking of Germany, Roosevelt had time to focus on Japan and military advancements. Island hopping and naval battles against a disorganized Japan is one thing. Standing toe-to-toe against the Wehrmacht is just a whole different ballgame. In our timeline, an unprepared America faced significant defeats in the Philippines and North Africa, losing hundreds of unescorted vessels during the so-called U-boat happy time. Here those lessons are a lot bloodier. In this scenario, we have the crushing defeat in the Azores, the German Blitz in the Middle East, and even bigger losses to the U-boats all throughout the second half of 1945. But now, it's 1946. It's time for the Allies to get off the ropes and start counterpunching. Oh, and when I say the Allies, I really do mean it. Like many of you have pointed out, it's a shame that so much of the Allied war effort is centered around Britain and America. So hey, let's take a second and give the other coalition members the spotlight. Why not? We really need to retire the French surrender memes. You try to hold out against the Blitz. Whole world practically fought Germany for 4 more years, yet France was supposed to hold them off. Alright. Even after the fall of Paris, French resistance fighters sabotaged supply lines, provided crucial intel that made D-Day possible. The Free French fought in the Battle of Bir Hakeim in 1942, holding off Rommel's Africa Corps. Even if a nation was officially out of the war, its people weren't. The 303 Squadron in the RAF was made up of 145 Polish pilots, and they had the highest kill ratio. The Polish Cipher Bureau broke early Enigma codes before handing their findings over to Turing. The Warsaw Uprising tied down entire German divisions, and the Polish Armored Division played key roles in Normandy and the liberation of the Netherlands. Let's also not forget that the British Empire was still a commonwealth, one with its own distinct people and leadership. Canada boasted the 3rd largest Allied fleet, escorting 75% of all North Atlantic convoys. At Juno, the Canadians advanced further than any other Allied unit. Mackenzie King's Canada built 1.4 million military vehicles, 16,000 aircraft, and supplied Britain with food and arms. In fact, its output when it came to war supplies was equal to that of Japan and Italy combined, featuring 4.5 billion rounds of ammunition. Canada was even crucial for the Manhattan Project, demonstrated by their findings at Montreal and Chalk River. As for Australia, their divisions, like the Rats of Tobruk, were crucial in holding up the Desert Fox. They stopped Japan's advance in New Guinea, and handed them their first major defeat at the Battle of Milne Bay. Australia, nicknamed the Unsinkable Aircraft Carrier, became the HQ of General MacArthur after he fled the Philippines. Over the course of the war, 1 million US troops passed through the continent. When Britain was cold and starving, it warmed itself with Australian wool and ate Australian beef. The Broken Hill mines supplied to the home isle with iron, lead, and zinc, with which it built its ships, tanks, and bullets. New Zealand also gave its fair share. In fact, 1 in 12 Kiwis entered into service, which is the highest per capita troop contribution of any allied nation. Meanwhile, India supplied the largest all-volunteer force in history. 2.5 million troops served in North Africa, Italy, and Burma. At the Siege of Kohima, also called the Stalingrad of the East, it was their effort which stopped the Japanese invasion of India. South Africa as a whole backed the empire, and supplied the Manhattan Project with gold and uranium, with troops fighting in almost every theater, including Madagascar against Vichy France. Unlike the first one, this was truly a world war, with almost every nation entangled in some way in the conflict. Greece held off the Italians for 6 months. Yugoslav partisans waged a guerrilla war in the Balkans. Norwegian commandos destroyed heavy water plants, crippling the Führer's fledgling nuclear program. Czechs disposed of Reinhard Heydrich and paid the price. Brazil sent 25,000 troops against Italy. Dutch and Belgian resistance fighters fought Japan and Indonesia and made the A-bomb possible. If even half of these nations were more complacent, the Germans wouldn't have been stretched so thin. Now back to our timeline. You would still have all of these movements coalesce by the start of 1946. They learn from their mistakes and form into one, under the combined leadership of Montgomery and Eisenhower. No matter how tight the Iron Fist is, no matter how many resistance fighters are put down, the underground networks continue to wreak havoc on the already overexpanded Third Reich. Sure, the bombings of Cologne and Hamburg might dissuade some of the fighters as they grapple with who's the lesser evil, but at the same time, the A-bomb arsenal, which was only ramping up, instills fear into some not-so-willing Axis partners, like Spain and Turkey. Out of all of these resistance groups, though, none of them could rival the sheer hatred of leftover, surviving Soviets. Even with more resources and troops scouring the East, it isn't enough to tame the Russian wilderness, especially in the midst of a prolonged conflict. Countless uprisings are a constant threat until the AA line, followed by a semi-functioning remnant state beyond it. Since things were already pretty bad for the Soviet government in our timeline, we know with absolute certainty that Stalin's purges and hand-picked cabinet was with him until the end. This means that he's still out there in the Siberian wilderness. Most likely Yekaterinburg, Omsk, or Irkutsk. Like China in our timeline, they would carry on the fight in some way, even if it wasn't as nearly well supplied. After the fall of northern Iran, Soviet Siberia is hard to supply by the Allies, whether by Arctic, Pacific, or hell, Himalayas. But this small eastern remnant does open front number 184 for the Axis, and it's still a headache. Finland and Hungary would use the bulk of their forces helping to quell these lands and get the Ukrainian grain going, while squads are sent into the depths of Siberia, never to return. Speaking of which, it just so happens that 1946 featured a major famine in southwest Russia due to a drought, described as the most severe famine since 1891. This led to the death of 1 million people. It's easy to imagine that its impact here would be 3 times as bad due to the occupation and destruction of infrastructure. And we all know that famine leads to disease and resistance. We could put a border on the map signifying Axis control, but the truth is, the moment Germany blinks is the moment hundreds of desolate villages take up arms against their occupiers, creating a major headache. I could spend the next 30 minutes covering resistance groups in Yugoslavia, France, Poland, but for the sake of pacing, let's just assume that throughout this entire conflict, this invisible layer is a constant burden on the Axis war effort. All of this pressure, combined with the overconfident Führer, leads to ultimately one destination. Like many horrendous ideas, this strategic catastrophe starts out as a pretty innovative decision to a unique problem. We can look back at Napoleon's invasion of Russia, Churchill's Gallipoli, or Moustache Man's Stalingrad, and laugh at them. But each one of these ideas had a lot of merits on paper. This next one's no different. From the German perspective, what's the quickest way to end the war by this point? Take Britain. Duh. Yeah, and they're trying. Outside of that though, what ingenious move could Moustache Man make to sweep the board? What was the Ardennes Forest of 1946? Go ahead. Guess, Jimmy. I'll give you a second. Alright, time's up. In my eyes, it's Egypt. You take Egypt through the Sinai. The Sinai Peninsula is mostly desert, with rugged mountains in the south and large expanses of sand and gravel everywhere else. But its location is everything. While the Axis hold the Mediterranean, the Allies control the Red Sea, allowing them to hold on to this crucial territory. The goal here is to take the British by surprise, using Rommel's panzer divisions to capture the Suez Canal from the east. By doing so, the Mediterranean is completely shut off, and the rich oil supply of Egypt is seized in the process. This not only dooms North Africa, but frees up the Luftwaffe to focus even more on the English Channel. Combine that with finishing off Iran and Iraq, and Uncle Sam is left footing the entire oil bill, which, considering the constant shipping and large navies, was pretty extensive. I mean, you could realistically wait, deploy a fresh new army in Libya, and not go through a literal desert, but once again, Moustache Man had IBS, Parkinson's, coronary artery disease, syphilis, and a bit of a meth addiction. Judging by the countless declassified documents, the Allies learned from their mistakes at the start of the war, and were preparing for every eventuality. The Suez was beyond precious, and despite the destruction of coastal Egypt, the rest of it was armed to the teeth. Not to mention that it's hard to be surprised when you know your enemy's every move. Remember, the German High Command has no idea that the Enigma code is broken. In this alternate scenario, it cost the Germans over 1,000 tanks, the Desert Fox himself, or potentially his career, and some of the most experienced crews Germany had. This military debacle is exactly what the Allies needed, and by utilizing the Red Sea, a large force under General Montgomery is assembled in order to push west into Italian Libya. On the other end of the North African theater, Eisenhower organizes the invasion of Spanish Morocco, after key ports are taken over with the help of US Marines and British commandos. Germany fortified every inch of coastal France, and aided in the fortification of Spain once they entered the war. But the vast coastline of Morocco is impossible to fully protect. U-boats could wreak havoc over time, but this is way outside of the Kriegsmarine's comfort zone. Once several small beachheads are established, Allied commandos push into the mountains, creating a ragtag group, with the goal of making the Axis bleed as Montgomery pushes through. As an added bonus, Morocco practically negates a significant part of the Azores threat. America ships tanks through the Red Sea, while Germany uses the Mediterranean to feed forces into North Africa and the Middle East. But the Germans can't gain control over the Atlantic and the British sky, while the Allies can't penetrate the Mediterranean Sea. Both sides flex their manpower pool and industry for minimal gains. And then, the nukes come in. Not too long ago, I posted this poll, asking the community on how you would use the finite amount of nukes America had at the time, and I'm going to use the percentages from this poll in this scenario. In the first 6 months of 1946, America produces 4 more nukes, 3 of which are dropped on key industrial centers using the upgraded B-36 Peacemaker, flying at 40,000 feet with more agility than early fighter jets, at an altitude rendering Axis radar and anti-air entirely obsolete. This was America's answer to what they would do if Britain fell, and it meant that everything was now within range. So here's the locations, based on your choices. Bomb number 1, Essen, the most important city in the industrial Ruhr Valley, home to the Krupp Steelworks and many factories for arms and munitions. Bomb number 2, Berlin, Reasons are kinda obvious, and it doesn't actually kill Moustache Man, who by this point would be hiding out in his East Prussian bunker. Bomb number 3, the Ploiești oil fields in Romania, blowing up a key oil refinery and increasing the strain on the German war machine. Bomb number 4, Baku, the most valuable oil refinery outside of the United States, and precious prize of the Reich. These same bombers would also frequently fly out and wreak havoc on other crucial targets, dry docks, airfields, even key occupied cities. The Kriegsmarine is powerful and inflicts heavy casualties on its rivals, but German production cannot keep up with its sustained losses. But for that matter, neither could the British. This heat map tracks 30,000 bombings on Britain from our timeline, sustained in the Blitz. It's safe to assume that here that number is just going to be tenfold, and far more devastating. In his desperation, Churchill pitches a massive attack on Crete, an operation designed to break German hold on the eastern Mediterranean and turn the tide in Egypt and the Levant. This desperate move ends up in an even bigger disaster than the one in our timeline. Montgomery is halted in Tunisia, but without a doubt, the bombed-out German industry would just not be able to keep up with the losses for so long. The 10 million soldier sinkhole which the Eastern Front was, is merely reduced to about 2.5 million at best, while the B-36 and nukes are in limited supply. It was the British, not German industry, which suffered more under these circumstances. And just because the American industry is invulnerable, it doesn't mean it can keep fighting forever. While dictatorships can justify sending millions to the slaughter, democracies run by different rules. In our time, nearly 200,000 Americans lost their lives in Europe, while another 300,000 were wounded throughout the world. What happens in this alternate timeline when that figure doubles or even triples? And for what? Retaking Europe? That's completely out of reach. Iraq? Libya? Meanwhile, the nuking of Berlin, Cologne, French and former Soviet lands just make excellent propaganda tools, raising the tension for peace within Congress, the War Cabinet, hell, even occupied territories. By this point, the bombing of Pearl Harbor was a distant blur, 5 years in the past. Germany broke the peace treaty after Dunkirk, and there's rumors of its actions in occupied Europe, but the nuclear bombings? Ouch. In our timeline, the New York Daily News and Chicago Tribune celebrated the destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. A Gallup poll showed 85% approval from the public, who believed it saved lives by ending the war. Keep in mind, the US government censored graphic images until 1952 and dismissed radiation sickness as Japanese propaganda. But by August 1946, the New Yorker devoted an entire issue to John Hershey's Hiroshima, a harrowing account of 6 survivors. Christian leaders called the bombings a moral catastrophe. Einstein warned of nuclear annihilation. Now, I want you to add 3 more ingredients to the pot. Number 1, 2 out of 6 bombings here are not in Germany. Number 2, places like Italy, Austria, Spain, Turkey, and even France would be considered as viable targets for future bombings. And number 3, you can't use the argument that they ended the war. Victory is at least 2 years away, and by that time, there wouldn't be a single city left standing in England. Unless... There's always a conundrum when it comes to alternate scenarios. Where to end? How does this end? Well, there's a few possibilities. For Moustache Man, by 1944 in our timeline, Parkinson's was taking a toll. His tremors, his posture, his flat speech are all well documented. How long did he really have left? That's one of the mysteries here. He could have lasted until the late 50s, or maybe had a sudden heart attack by 1946. We'll never know. Maybe he goes out during the nuking of Berlin. Or maybe his own men are the one to depose him. A high-level coup, perhaps near the tail end of 1946. something along the lines of Operation Valkyrie. Segments of high command become sick of the bombed cities, the failures at sea, and the move to send Rommel into Sinai. Maybe that's a reason to depose the Führer. Who's to say? Germany's allies certainly wouldn't be so forgiving. Allies who didn't share Germany's exact philosophies were sick of the war and feared the A-bomb. Maybe the German government sues for peace, just not out of a position of weakness. In fact, it would most likely be the Allies who reach out hoping to end the war. After our D-Day, the Allies looked upon Europe like a buffet. Hell, Eisenhower even parked his troops in France and waited for infrastructure to be built. But here, even with the dropping of the bombs, an advance on Berlin seems like an impossible task. To be honest, I originally envisioned an Allied landing in Morocco, followed by a D-Day on the Spanish coast. But the more I read about how complicated D-Day was, as well as how difficult the Spanish terrain is, the more I realized this would have been a disaster. Not to mention that Churchill wasn't even a fan of D-Day in our timeline, much less this hardcore version of it. By the time the Normandy landings happened, Germany was already wrecked. Stalingrad, Kursk, Italy pretty much lost, and most importantly, supplies and veterans ran dry. In this alternate scenario, none of these factors apply. Railroads would be used to deploy German troops to the mountainous southern Spain. Even if the Allies did push through, there's two things to consider. One, they would never, and I mean never, get past the Pyrenees. But more importantly, number two, we're talking about upwards of potentially 1 million casualties here. This is a conflict that already had 3 distinct phases in theaters all over the world. It tops our World War II. This is the most destructive conflict by a wide margin. South Africa and India begin to slip as the human cost becomes insurmountable. Independence movements grow in popularity. In our timeline, tensions in Australia were extremely high as American troops fought with the locals in what is now called the Brownout Battles. Drunken brawls over the fact that the American troops were getting preferential treatment. Here, that also boils to an extreme. Frustration over lost family members, forced conscription, protests fill the streets of Washington. Totalitarian regimes can afford to throw millions into the grinder, but democracies have to play by different rules. Pushed by his cabinet, Truman signs the peace deal with 2 ideas in mind. 1. America would be the sole nuclear power in the world. They could always come back and wipe the floor with Germany in some follow-up war, with or without Oppenheimer's consent. 2. He could now turn his full attention on Japan, bombing it sky high to salvage his reputation. The peace deal is simple. Palestine is returned to the British Empire, and a new pro-Axis Kurdish state is formed with oil-rich Mosul as its capital. To its south, what remains of Iraq is returned to the British as a protectorate. Syria remains under Vichy France, while all, and I do mean all, of continental Europe is left in Axis hands. Portugal and Italy regain their African colonies, and besides those in North Africa, all colonies previously held by France, Belgium, and the Netherlands come under American authority. There is no way Truman gives up all that uranium. To make this deal work, both sides have to throw an uncomfortable ally under the bus. For the Allies, the choice is easy. The remnants of the Soviet Union are disavowed, and in return, Germany severs all ties with Japan, which is still struggling in its conquest of China. Every year, in each theater could have been an hour-long video on its own, but with every step into the unknown, there's just so much more to consider. So you know what? I'm ending it there. How does the British Empire rebuild? How quickly does violence and nuke propaganda pacify the French? How does an Axis dependent on a war economy handle peace? What happens to India? How does the Japanese theater unfold? There was already a colossal amount of effort that went into this mega project, but sometimes, some stories just have to end, even if there's still so much to say. But that's how it always is. This is Cody of Alternate History Hub. Once again, special thanks to War Thunder for sponsoring this video. You can play today on Xbox, PlayStation, PC, or mobile. If you are new or haven't played in 6 months, you can click the link in the description to get a massive bonus pack, multiple premium vehicles, and Eagle of Valor, an exclusive vehicle decorator, plus 100,000 Silver Lions, and 7 days of premium account. Oh, man, that voice hurts to do.